Instrument number 1, a broom. 5-year-old Jimmy, Seattle, 1947. Too poor for a real guitar, playing a cleaning tool for hours while his father worked. Instrument number 2, a $5 beat-up acoustic. 12-year-old Jimmy, teaching himself to play. No lessons, no music theory, just listening and learning. Instrument number 3, a white Fender Stratocaster. 27-year-old Jimmy, standing on the Woodstock stage, playing the Star-Spangled Banner to 400,000 people, creating the most iconic guitar moment in history. 24 years, 3 instruments, one impossible journey, from the poorest neighborhoods of Seattle to the biggest stage in rock and roll. From a kid who couldn't read music to the man Rolling Stone would call the greatest instrumentalist in the history of rock music. This is the story of Jimi Hendrix, but it's also the story of every kid who ever felt like they didn't have enough, like they weren't good enough, like the world would never give them a chance. Because sometimes the greatest legends don't start with advantages, they start with a broom, a dream, and a sound only they can hear. Seattle, Washington, 1947. 5-year-old Johnny Allen Hendrix lived in a small house in a poor neighborhood with his father, Al. Money was always tight. Al worked as a gardener, taking whatever jobs he could find, trying to keep food on the table. Johnny's mother, Lucille, was in and out of their lives. She was only 17 when Johnny was born, and her relationship with Al was stormy and complicated. Sometimes she was there, sometimes she wasn't. Johnny never knew which it would be. Al gave his son a simple chore: sweep the floors while he was at work. It was an easy job. Take the broom, clean up, done. But every single time Al came home, the same thing happened. The floors would still be dirty, and there would be broom straws scattered all around Johnny's bed. "Didn't you sweep the floor?" Al would ask. "Yeah, I did," Johnny would say. But Al knew better. He'd find his son sitting on the edge of the bed, the broom held like a guitar, strumming imaginary strings, making sounds with his mouth, lost completely in his own world, for hours every single day. At first, Al was frustrated. The boy had one job. But the more he watched, the more he understood. His son wasn't just playing around. Johnny was hearing something: music, melodies, rhythms, things that existed only in his head. And that broom wasn't a cleaning tool to the boy. It was an instrument. Al couldn't afford to buy his son a real guitar. They could barely afford rent and food. But he understood that whatever was happening with Johnny and that broom was important. So he went to a pawn shop and found an old ukulele with only one string. It was beat up, scratched, barely functional, but it was something. He gave it to Johnny, and the boy's face lit up like it was Christmas morning. Johnny played that one-string ukulele every day until the string broke. Then he'd fix it and play it some more. He played it so much that the wood started to crack. He played it until there was literally nothing left to play. By the time Johnny was 12 years old, Al had managed to save $5. He used it to buy a real guitar from a friend, a beat-up acoustic with worn strings and scratches all over it. To Al, it was $5 he could barely afford. To Johnny, it was everything. And here's where the story gets remarkable. Johnny never took a single guitar lesson. Nobody taught him how to read music. He didn't know what chords were called or how scales worked. He just listened. He'd sit by his father's old record player and listen to B.B. King, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, blues and rock and roll records that Al would bring home. And somehow, just by listening, Johnny figured out how to play what he heard. Al Hendrix would come home from work and hear music coming from Johnny's room, not the fumbling attempts of a beginner, real music, songs, melodies, things that sounded impossibly good for a 12-year-old who'd never had a lesson in his life. Al Hendricks would later say that he knew his son was special, but he had no idea how special. He said, "I just thought he was good with music. I didn't know he was going to change the world." But before Johnny could change anything, he had to survive a childhood that was falling apart around him. Johnny's mother, Lucille, had never been able to escape the demons that haunted her. The drinking got worse. The relationship with Al became more volatile. By the time Johnny was 7, Lucille had left the family. Johnny would see her occasionally, brief visits that were more painful than comforting. He loved his mother, but he barely knew her. In 1958, when Johnny was 16 years old, he came home from school to devastating news. His mother was dead. Lucille Hendricks, only 33 years old, had died from cirrhosis of the liver. A life of alcohol and struggle had ended far too soon.
Johnny didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't break down. He just went quiet. That night, alone in his room, he picked up his guitar and played for hours. The guitar had become more than an instrument. It had become his voice, his therapist, his only reliable companion in a world that kept taking things away from him. Years later, when Jimmy wrote songs like Little Wing, people who knew him understood what they were really about. She's walking through the clouds with a circus mind that's running wild. It was about Lucille, the mother he lost, the absence that shaped everything he would become. At 16, Johnny legally changed his name to James Marshall Hendricks, Jimmy to his friends, and he made a decision. He needed to escape Seattle, needed to find a path forward. In 1961, at 19 years old, Jimmy enlisted in the United States Army. He became a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne Division. The military was structure, discipline, a world completely different from the chaos of his childhood. But even in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, training to jump out of airplanes, Jimmy couldn't stop playing guitar. He'd practice in the barracks, jam with other soldiers, find any excuse to play. In 1962, after injuring his ankle during a parachute jump, Jimmy was honorably discharged. The military chapter was over. The music chapter was about to explode. For the next 4 years, Jimmy lived the life of a traveling musician. He played backup guitar for some of the biggest names in R&B: Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Ike and Tina Turner, Sam Cooke. He was paid barely enough to survive, sleeping in cheap motels in the back of tour buses, eating whatever he could afford. But Jimmy was learning. Every night on stage, he was absorbing techniques, studying the greats, developing his own style. And he was starting to realize something. He didn't want to be a backup guitarist anymore. He wanted to be the star. In 1966, at 24 years old, Jimmy was playing in small clubs in New York's Greenwich Village with a band he called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. He was still unknown, still struggling, still wondering if he'd ever make it. Then one night, everything changed. A woman named Linda Keith walked into the club. She was dating Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and she had an ear for talent. When she heard Jimmy play, she immediately knew he was special. She started bringing people to see him, musicians, managers, anyone who would listen. One of those people was Chaz Chandler, the bassist for the Animals, who was looking to become a manager. Chandler watched Jimmy play one song and made him an offer that night. "Come to London. I'll introduce you to Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck. I'll make you a star." Jimmy didn't ask about money or contracts. He asked, "Will you really introduce me to Clapton?" On September 24, 1966, Jimi Hendrix arrived in London. Within a week, he jammed with Cream and made Eric Clapton walk off his own stage. Within a month, he'd formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Within 6 months, he had a #1 hit in England. The boy who played a broom in Seattle was becoming a phenomenon in London. From 1966 to 1969, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released 3 albums that changed rock music forever. Are You Experienced made them international superstars. Axis, Bold as Love proved they weren't a fluke. Electric Ladyland cemented them as legends. But by 1969, Jimi was restless again. The Experience had broken up. He was experimenting with new sounds, new musicians, new ideas. And then came an opportunity that would define his legacy: Woodstock. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair was supposed to be the biggest music festival ever held. 3 days of peace and music in upstate New York. Over 400,000 people showed up, 10 times more than expected. The roads were gridlocked. The festival became free because there was no way to control the massive crowd. Jimi was offered the highest fee of any performer, $18,000, to close the festival on Sunday night. From the $5 guitar his father bought him to an $18,000 payday at the biggest concert in history, the journey was complete. Except it wasn't going to go the way anyone planned. Technical delays and weather problems pushed the schedule back by hours. Jimi wasn't going on at midnight Sunday like planned. He'd have to wait until Monday morning. By then, most of the 400,000 people had gone home. Work and school were starting. People were exhausted, muddy, ready to leave. August 18, 1969, 8:30 in the morning. Only about 40,000 people remained. The sun was already up. The festival grounds were covered in mud and garbage. This was supposed to be Jimi's triumphant closing performance, the culmination of everything he'd worked for. Instead, he was playing in broad daylight for a tenth of the crowd, to a bunch of exhausted, muddy festival-goers who looked ready to pass out. Jimi took the stage with his new band, Gypsy, Sun, and Rainbows. They'd barely rehearsed together. The performance started rough, guitars out of tune, songs sloppy, the band struggling to find their groove. This was not the tight, powerful Jimi Hendrix Experience. This was messy and unfocused. People in the remaining crowd started drifting away. This wasn't what they'd stayed for. Even the film crew started packing up their equipment, thinking the performance was a bust. But then, nearly 2 hours into the set, something shifted. Maybe Jimi stopped worrying about the band and just decided to play from his soul. Maybe he looked at that muddy, exhausted crowd and realized they were the ones who'd stayed, the true believers who deserved something special. Jimi stepped up to the microphone and began playing the Star-Spangled Banner. What happened next would become the most iconic guitar performance in rock history. Jimi didn't just play the American national anthem, he transformed it. Using feedback, distortion, and his Stratocaster's tremolo bar, he created sounds nobody had ever heard before. The wail of bombs falling, the scream of fighter jets, the chaos of war, the anguish of a generation torn apart by Vietnam. The crowd that had been drifting away stopped. The film crew that had been packing up kept their cameras rolling. Everyone understood they were witnessing something that would never be repeated. This wasn't just a guitar solo. It was a commentary on America, on war, on the chaos of the 1960s. It was protest and patriotism mixed together in a way that made both sides of every argument stop and listen. It was the sound of a generation that didn't know if they loved or hated their country, played by a man who'd served in the army but questioned the war. When director Michael Wadley was editing the Woodstock documentary, he made a crucial decision. He ended the entire film with Jimi's performance. It was the perfect conclusion to 3 days of chaos, music, and the death of the 1960s dream. The film became a massive hit, and Jimi's Star-Spangled Banner became the moment that defined an entire era. The 5-year-old boy who played a broom because he couldn't afford a guitar had just created the most important musical statement of his generation. From a cleaning tool to Woodstock, from poverty to legend, 24 years. But Jimi Hendrix's story has one more chapter, and it's the one that breaks everyone's heart.
Just over a year after Woodstock, on September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London. He was 27 years old. He'd taken sleeping pills prescribed to his girlfriend, had an allergic reaction, and died in his sleep. It was preventable. It was tragic. It was the end of a genius who'd barely scratched the surface of what he could have accomplished. Jimi's active career as a star, from the moment he arrived in London to the day he died, lasted exactly 4 years. 4 years! That's all it took for him to completely change rock music forever. Today, more than 50 years after his death, Jimi Hendrix is still considered the greatest guitarist who ever lived. Rolling Stone magazine ranks him #1. Every guitarist who picks up an instrument knows his name. His techniques, his sounds, his songs, they're studied in music schools around the world. But here's what makes Jimi's story more than just a musical legend. It's about what's possible when you refuse to let circumstances define you. Jimi was poor. He never had a real lesson. He couldn't read music. His mother died when he was a teenager. He was a black musician in an industry dominated by white artists. Everything was stacked against him. But he had something nobody could take away. He could hear music that didn't exist yet, and he had the determination to make that music real, even if he had to start with a broom. Every kid who's ever felt like they don't have the right equipment, the right teachers, the right advantages, Jimi's story is for you. Every person who's been told they can't make it because they don't have the right background or education, Jimi's story is for you. Because the greatest guitarist in history started with a cleaning tool, a $5 guitar, and sounds only he could hear. And 24 years later, he stood on a muddy stage at Woodstock and showed 400,000 people, and eventually the entire world, that genius doesn't need permission. It just needs a chance. From a broom to Woodstock, from poverty to legend, from a little boy hearing sounds nobody else could hear to a man who made the whole world listen. That's the story of Jimi Hendrix, and it proves that sometimes the most powerful instrument isn't the one you're given, it's the one you refuse to put down, no matter how broken, how cheap, or how impossible it seems. If this story of determination, genius, and refusing to accept limitations inspired you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear that greatness doesn't require perfect circumstances. It just requires refusing to quit. Tell us in the comments about a time when you had to make do with less and still found a way to create something amazing. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories about the legends who proved that where you start doesn't determine where you finish.